An annually resolved 5,700-year storm archive reveals drivers of Caribbean cyclone frequency. Sounds like a thriller, doesn't it? Yep, I know. This is just bringing in the clicks here, bringing in the views. Yeah, we're going to dig into this research article from Science Advances, a very recent one. And why? Why am I interested in this? Well, of course, I have an interest in Young Earth Creationism, the debate over the age of the Earth. And this is yet another example. Maybe we should label this reason 957,452 for why the Earth can't be young. I I learned so much about the world by thinking about young Earth creationism and thinking about how different pieces of physical evidence that we collect don't fit the young Earth creationist model. And because I'm interested in young Earth creationism, I end up learning a ton about stuff that I probably never would have read before. And this is something maybe you likely have never heard of this article, maybe don't know anything about this type of research. And so, yeah, I'm going to work in a little climate change, question into this as well. So this is me unscripted, just opening up an article, and we're going to take a look. I've screen captured a couple shots from this article, being cognizant of the copyright here, and this is for educational purposes. So, scientific advances. Schmidt et al., a bunch of German authors who have gone to the Caribbean, specifically an island off Belize, and they have drilled down and collected a 30-meter long sediment core from the bottom of the Great Blue Hole. All right, one of the most famous blue holes in the Caribbean. And what's revealed there is a history of tropical cyclones. And depending on the dating methods and how you feel about those dating methods, it allows us to determine something about the frequency of cyclones over, the last few centuries, the last few thousand years. And there's a lot of interest in, is cyclone frequency increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it changing in any particular manner over time? Is it relatively consistent over time? There's a bunch of studies in the Caribbean that do this, and this is one of the best examples, best recent example of a piece of data that can be used to address that particular question. So let me read the abstract, and then I'm just going to show you a couple figures from this article, and we'll talk through what they've done, what we've learned from that, and of course we're going to apply that to the question of how would a young Earth creationist explain the data that's presented in this particular paper, and how might they react to it. All right, so let's dig in. Predictions of tropical cyclone frequencies are hampered by insufficient knowledge of their natural variability in the past. If you wanted to know how often were there hurricanes in a particular location in the Caribbean 5,000 years ago, well, you'd have to have some data, right? You'd have to have some source of data to examine that. Not just simply extrapolation from the present and the past. You'd want to know what was the past conditions. So to remedy that situation, what has this group done? A 30-meter long sediment core from the Great Blue Hole, a marine sinkhole offshore Belize, provides the longest available continuous and annually resolved tropical cyclone frequency record. Now let's notice the words here. Annually resolved, meaning they are proposing that what they're seeing here is an annual record for 5,700 years, which means they must have some way to measure year by year what's happening, right? Or be able to see each individual year. Usually we think of that as being varves, all right? Couplets of sedimentation that represent different seasons, allowing us to track back or count back years. This record expands our understanding derived from instrumental monitorings, right? So for 73 years, we have pretty good instrumental recordings that allow us to know where tropical cyclones have occurred and what their strength is in this region. We have historical documentation. So about roughly 173 years, we have records of people reporting tropical cyclones from this particular region in the Caribbean. And paleontological records, 2,000 years of paleontological records. And now what they're doing is they've said what our study is doing is it's expanding that to 5,700 years. And in that 5,700 years, they find a total of 694 events identified in this 30-meter sediment column. Now, what these events are is events that they're identifying as large cyclones. And I'll show you in the image what we mean by like how we're going to categorize those. They display a distinct regional trend of increasing storminess in the southwestern Caribbean. In other words, you look at 694 events and you ask yourself if you know what years they all occurred in, right? Well, then you have a nice data set to be able to answer the question. For this particular area, have there been more cyclones per year in the past than in the present, or are there more in the present than there have been in the past? And as you can see here, there's a regional trend of increasing storminess or increasing numbers of tropical cyclones. This follows an orbital-driven shift in the intertropical convergence zone. That's the changes in the overall climate, weather patterns over long periods of time. Superimposed short-term variations match Holocene climate intervals and originate from solar irradiance, controlled sea surface temperature anomalies, and climate phenomena models. These modes. All these are different kinds of things that have been examined with respect to climate change over time and different variables that affect those. We're not going to go into the details on that stuff. We're just going to stick with the sediment column and the numbers and thinking about where that sediment comes from and how long it takes to accumulate. A 21st century extrapolation suggests an unprecedented increase in tropical cyclone frequency attributable to the industrial age warming. All right, so you can see where they're going with this particular article and what they've one of their possible conclusions. All right, so here we are. Here's our study site, and it's just this little it's a carbonate or limestone platform with a coral reef surrounding it and on top of it. And here it is. And we see that there are some little green patches along here. And those green patches would be areas that are above water level most of the time and therefore support some vegetation, terrestrial vegetation. And in the middle of this platform, there is a hole. Right? It doesn't look like much there, but here's this picture of it, which is a couple hundred meters wide. So 250 to 300 feet wide. Blue hole. It's called a blue hole because it's a very deep chamber below this, right? It's like, in this case, it's about 400 feet deep. So it's one of the deepest blue holes. And it's just a hole it goes straight down into this rock. And so anything that falls down inside this hole is going to end up at the bottom, right? And so sediments are accumulating on the bottom. So now imagine that most of the time, this is a very placid environment. I mean, even a thunderstorm or something like that is not going to disrupt this particular area very much. Tiny bit of sediment gets washed in, right? And organisms living in the water are going to die and fall potentially to the bottom, and that's going to accumulate on the bottom. But once in a while, there's going to be a very large climatic event, a tropical cyclone, right? That comes near this area. And that's what this diagram down here is, right? We have, these are all the historically known cyclones from the last 75 years or so, in which here's the names of these cyclones, and they have passed within 100 kilometers, right? The idea is that a cyclone of, a tropical cyclone or a hurricane that's within 100 kilometers is going to cause enough disruption. It's going to cause enough disruption in the ocean that it's going to cause waves to come up over this platform, right? And wash material, right, from the sides of this area into the hole. And so then there's going to be an influx for a day or two of larger amounts of material, and material that's not the usual material that's falling down to the bottom of the hole. All right, so you have down here, you got your fair weather suspension fallout, right? Very fine small particles, right? And very little of it. This is very clear water, right? And so it's very slowly, building up on the bottom. And then you have storm waves, surges from cyclones, which are going to cause erosion on the sides and then also bringing in material from elsewhere on this platform. All right, and that's going to deposit it into this blue hole, and it's going to fall to the bottom. and accumulate. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get a record of, just very, very, very slow accumulation with mostly the same stuff, right? For potentially long periods of time, because if it's a decade between times in which a tropical cyclone passes over this location, you're going to have 10 years of nothing, and then you're going to have a distinguishable layer of sediment in the core that you've pulled up from the bottom of this blue hole that is going to indicate a disruption, all right, a significant disruption. And depending on the amount of material there, it tells you either that you had a very large hurricane, maybe 100 kilometers away, or you had maybe a minor tropical cyclone that was very close, or you had a major hurricane that went directly over the hole, in which case you're going to get the biggest disruption. Right, so you can get some rough idea of the potential sizes or the amount of disruption that occurred. So you've got this record then of events. And what we say, there are 694 distinguishable events that occurred that would have to be a large enough climatic disruption to cause enough material to go into the blue hole that we would be able to see it in the core sections. And so that's 964 over some period of time. Now, the question there is then how much time? Now they're saying 5,700 years. Now, where do they get the 5,700 years from? Right, the 5,700 years comes from a couple different ways of estimating that time. One is Varve counts. And so there is a seasonality in the Caribbean in which you have different organisms growing at different temperature water. You also have disruption really only during the time, the tropical season, that's more disruptive. And so what you get is you end up with these, the ability to see in very, 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 very fine layers, differences between slow accumulation during very calm times and somewhat cooler water, and then warmer water, differences in salinity, differences in different compositions and oxygen ratios and so forth. All right, so I'm not going to go into the details of like how they go through and scan scan the core and actually do the counting. Right. But they feel like that they can count about 5,700. Basically, you can think of them as annual rings. And then within some of those rings are these much larger sediment deposits that come from cyclone events. So the other method of dating would be carbon-14. And so on this chart here, what we're seeing here, and I just want to show you what we've got, is we have 12,000 years of sediment core, and they've done 3,000 centimeters. All right, so that's 30 meters. All right, 30 meters is a little over 100 feet. So 100 feet of sediments. That's not a whole lot, but the deposition rate is very, very low. You see here, 2.41 millimeters on average, right, per annual millimeters annually. So 2.41 millimeters down here, 3.8 millimeters, and more recently, much more than 2.4. I can't remember what their estimate was. Something like 5 or so millimeters annually. And so you get that from the Varve counts, right? If you count Varves, 100 Varves, and you count up, well, how much depth was that? And divide by the depth, then what do you get? You get an average rate of number of millimeters of sediment deposited per year. And if you measure it over 1,000 years, or you measure it over 5,000 years, you get an average over all those years. Now they're interested in, does the average change? So they take different bins, which would be like 1 to 100, 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400 in terms of the Varves. Get the averages for all those. Now what you can see is for long periods of time, the average has been relatively similar. Right, this from right here, all right, at just 100 years ago, all the way down to 5,000 years ago, right? Well, actually 5,700 years ago, which is the boundary right here. The sedimentation rate has been pretty consistent. which means if there have been cyclones, even if cyclones don't happen every year, if you're looking over 100 years, you're like, oh, well, there was like, 4 or 5 cyclones or 10 cyclones during that period. Well, the previous 100 years, there was about 10. The previous 100 years, there was around 10 or so. Now you're getting the idea that the number of cyclones that pass in this particular region is probably pretty consistent over long periods of time, because we have similar amounts of sediment accumulation over that period of time. So we had the Varve counts, and then I forgot, we had the carbon-14 counts, and what they do is they just go through and they pick out, like, they have little bits of organic material, right? So sometimes you're gonna have a piece of stick or a leaf or something like that. It's going to get blown into and over this hole and sink down to the bottom. And so they pull out little pieces of organic material, and then they carbon-14 date them. And so that's what these hash marks are, right? So the depth of the carbon-14, this marks the depth of that carbon-14, and then they date it. And in this case, if this mark right here at the depth where they took the sample, and then they get the sample date, and if that date matches the Varve count, then the gray line and the pinkish line, right, are overlapping. There's a slight area where it doesn't overlap so well, but you can see there's a good correlation between, you get a carbon-14 date, and then you look at the number of Varve counts you have, and the Varve count is similar. That's really compelling evidence that we've got, maybe not exactly 5,700 years of record here. Basically, the 5,700 goes down to here. And then below that, they're saying because the environment was different, it's a little bit harder to deal with. All right, so the first 5,700 years, amazing consistency of Varve count, carbon-14. Now, I got to show you what this inset is. All right, this inset is just the last 140 years. So they count 140 years of Varve counts, and that would just be right in here, right? I mean, this is 1,000 years. So we're just talking about here. And so right here is the last 140 Varve counts, all right, 140 Varves, which they're interpreting as 140 years. And so another way they're going to test this Varve counting is, you see there's this, there's a large volcanic eruption. And that happened in, if I remember right, 1982. All right. So 1982, well, that's, you see here, their Varve count, counting back some 42 years or so. And this study was begun in 2022, I think the core was taken. So, 42 years ago, yeah, that's right about on the mark. Right? So you count back 42 Varves, which they're interpreting as annual rings, and you get back to a layer that has an ash layer, right? Because if there's a volcano near enough and you put up enough ash can fall out directly down into the blue hole, right? And settle out in a very thin layer. And so that's what they see there. And you can take that ash and you can look at the chemical composition and so forth and confirm it came from that particular volcano. All right, so again, very nice correlation between a known historical event, the dating, the known, so you have a known date, and then the carbon-14 dating and all that. So now what you'll note is that up until 60 years ago, right, you had this sort of consistent amount of deposition. All right, now because of the way they've stretched this scale out, it doesn't look the same as over here, but that's basically this line here. That's basically this pink line right here. Constant deposition, not much difference, right? 2.41 plus or minus 0.04 millimeters annually. That's what's happening here. And then in the, some 60-ish years ago, right, which would be the And so in the 1960s, you see a pretty big change in the slope. Now, what could account for that increased slope? Well, increased deposition. I mean, it has to be increased deposition, right? If the annual rings are correct, and certainly seems like they must be, I have no reason to argue that for the last 100 years that the annual rings aren't the annual rings, right? Now, Young Earth Creationists are going to have a problem with 5,700 annual rings, right? Because that pushes it back before Noah's flood, right? So they're going to have to deny that these are annual rings and somehow there's multiple rings. But at least in the last 100 years, hard to argue that they're not annual rings, even though they look the same, as the other rings going down 5,700 years. So what would account for this change in the slope? Well, increased deposition. Where would the increased deposition come from? Right? It's like there's two things, and only one of them, the second one, doesn't really have a huge effect until more recently, and that is rising ocean levels. Rising ocean levels means more flooding of this particular area, so potentially bringing in a little more sediment. But I think that's going to be a very minor effect, and I think they discount that as even having any significance at all. The most obvious thing that would add to the sediment load, and it's confirmed by looking in the sediments themselves, is you have thicker little bands, all right, and more of them, which represent cyclones. Right? So there's your evidence of, at least for this area, I don't want to say it's the entire Caribbean, but for this particular region of the Caribbean, there's really strong evidence here that cyclone frequency and potentially strength of cyclones has increased, right, in the last 60 years. Our little figure over here, I think, is notable too for what we want to discuss when I'm done giving you the data, and that is that I haven't talked to you about, like, well, where in the world did this hole come from? Like, how do you get a big hole, right, in a carbonate platform? And so you basically have thick limestone. Well, limestone is what caves are made of, right? Or what a lot of caves are found in is limestone, should put it that way. And so you have to imagine going back in time, back to, say, the most recent ice age. Really multiple ice ages, but we'll just talk about the last ice age, all right? So like during the last ice age, what you would have had here is you would have had the ocean being 300, 350 feet lower than it is today, in which case you have a big island sitting here, right? Today, there's just a little tiny bit sitting above the surface. But in the past, you had a 300-foot tall island sticking out of the ocean, and there is abundant evidence, all right, in the sediments on top of it and embedded in it, that there was a tropical forest here. All right, there was a tropical forest in the past on this particular island, and on that island there was a big hole. All right, a big open hole in this case, not full of water, although the bottom would have had water in it. Right. But the idea is that in the past, during ice ages, when the water was so much low and the ocean was much lower, then you would have had dissolution you would have caves forming in this limestone, because there are caves forming in that limestone underneath right now, underneath those islands. And during that time, if you have a large enough cavern, and then you had the roof of that cavern fall out, right, fall down. All right. So then the roof falls down, and now you got a big hole. Right? You got a big hole going up to the sky. And for a while, that's just a big hole with either a dry or a wet basin, but there's not a lot of stuff falling in there. Right? You have, it rains sometimes, and a little bit of that causes some water to go down the side and get into the hole. But you have very little deposition across the entire 300 feet wide, all right, bottom of this thing. All right, and remember, they're taking their core section from the middle. So there's not going to be a lot of deposition in the middle. And that's what's represented down at the bottom of this figure, to say, like, at the bottom of the core, when you get down to 3,000 centimeters, right, 30 meters down, what you find is that you have very little evidence of deposition, right? The carbon-14 dates, all of a sudden, it's like, just a little bit tiny above, you're a lot older. So that means not much is happening here. And the composition of what's down there is very different, right? Because you have other organic matter that's down there from the forest above, and like leaves blowing in there and like all that kind of stuff, right? So it's totally different material. Then as the ocean begins to rise, there is water in the bottom of this hole, but not a lot of circulation. So you have kind of this anoxic zone in here. So you don't have a lot of living things in the water column. But then as the hole fills up with water as the ocean rises, because there's going to be caves and things like that link this to the ocean, right? There's going to be some flow. All right. Then you're going to have organisms living in that blue hole dying and material falling to the bottom. Right. And so you're going to have deposition there. All right. So And then eventually you reach a level where the water is filling the entire hole, and now you can have, now you have hurricanes and so forth coming over the top and pushing material into the hole in a different form of deposition than you would have had in the past. So now when you kind of add it up, they have this tropical frequency, and they're looking at periods of like high activity, low activity. So they can like break it down into like, there's decades of time or 100 years at a time, which we consider like, there just wasn't much activity in this part of the Caribbean. That doesn't mean that another part of the Caribbean has hurricanes. We know that the patterns change over time because global patterns of like on a more decadal sort of level, you got your like El Nino and La Nina phases that affect the Caribbean. And so that causes the weather patterns to shift. So sometimes there's very little chance of having a tropical cyclone in the southern Caribbean, and they're more in the northern Caribbean and so forth. This is why you have to do studies in blue holes in different locations. I don't think I didn't show you that on here, but you see these other stars on here. These are other places where we have drill cores through various locations in which there, in this case in Florida, it's a lake here, right? And so if there's a hurricane that comes near there, it's going to cause disruption and bring in material. And so they're looking at lake sediments there. And so what you're doing is you're trying to find multiple places in the Caribbean, do all these sediment profiles, look for evidences of disruption that would have been tropical cyclones, and then do a correlation analysis to figure out like, hopefully figure out the years that all those happened in, and then be able to look for patterns of like, hey, here's where the airflow is during, these centuries, and then it switches and so forth. And what's all this done for? Most of it's all done for the express purpose of trying to figure out like, what are the factors that affect tropical cyclone frequency, but also hopefully predicting what could happen in the future. Right? As the environment changes, what shifts will occur? Is everything going to shift up farther north so that Florida is in more danger? Or will there be a pattern of shifting tropical cyclones so that they go across the Caribbean and then run into the Yucatan Peninsula more, right? Those are things that, risk assessment people and those who sell life insurance and home insurance, all right, are very interested in, being able to understand the risks in the future. Okay, so let's just spend a couple minutes applying this to the whole question of young Earth creationism, because young Earth creationism, says that the world is only 6,000 years old. But more importantly, for our subject here, is that Noah's flood covered the entire world and essentially created the topography, all right, geography of what we see today, the geological column produced just 4,350 years ago. Right. So if according to them, if you were standing here on the earth 4,350 years ago, you'd just see a vast ocean, right? A chaotic vast ocean. And from that, all the different, as the water receded, then you have all this deposition, then you would have the formation of things like these coral reefs. All right. And somehow during that flood, you would have the entire carbonate platform. So that's this limestone here, right? You got all this limestone, which is what's in the Yucatan Peninsula. Like this is all limestone, which is all thought to have been, in the conventional way of thinking, all this is a shallow ocean, and you have deposition of calcium carbonate material, which is like, shells and coccoliths and little microorganisms that die, and their shells fall down to the bottom of the sea, and they pile up over time into thousands of feet. And then that all hardens, lithofies into rock, which then eventually begins to erode, right? And as it erodes, it forms the various islands that we have today and all the caves. There's zillions of caves in the Yucatan Peninsula. All right, the Yucatan Peninsula here. All right, and eventually, right, you end up with these islands, you end up with more coral growth on them, and because of the ocean going up and down through multiple ice ages, you have multiple events of cave formation, and then you have multiple different places all around in the Bahamas where you have caves that have the roofs have fallen in, creating these blue holes. So it's only after the blue hole forms that you can then begin to have deposition at the bottom of the blue hole, right? So in the young Earth creationist model, somehow you have to have, right, the limestone, you have to have erosion of the limestone to form these caves, right? So when the ocean's lower, now young Earth creationists would say there was an ice age, and it was like 4,000 years ago. And the ocean was lower at that time. So they have to say, like, just during a period of like 100 years ago, 100 years or so, all those caves formed, and they, these huge caves underneath these, platforms. And then you'd have to have the roof fall in. And so they've been collecting, the blue hole's been collecting stuff for the last, 3,800 years. Now, what we have here is 5,700 years of varves, but we actually have carbon-14 dating and a lower portion of the column that goes back to 6,000 years ago. And then there's other blue holes that are like, 10, 12, much older than that in terms of ages. Actually, I should say there's other blue holes that are probably much, much older from previous ice ages, not just the most recent one. Right, so they would have to compact all this. I think they would have to agree that, all right, the blue hole didn't exist before, say, the last ice age. So that's less than 4,000 years ago. And then all this sediment that is deposited at the bottom of the blue hole would have all had to have been deposited in just, 3,800 years. In which case, the number of events that occurred have to be compacted into a small area. So they really believe that must have been more tropical cyclones. But here's another inconsistency with their view. Many of them describe a chaotic world after Noah's flood 4,350 years ago, in which there was many storms, right? It was a much more chaotic world. There's a lot more erosion going on. They're trying to employ all these things to explain why you have massive erosion and changes in the topography of the world. But what this data suggests is actually there weren't, right? At the bottom of the blue hole, right? In the first, third of the sediments, there's not a lot of tropical cyclones there, right? In other words, it suggests it was a more placid environment in the past, and it's only become more active, right, in just the last 100 years. Right? The greatest amount of disturbance, the greatest amount of tropical activity has occurred in the last 100 years. And there's no evidence from the rest of the column that there was a time in the past in which everything was really crazy and wild. So that's inconsistent with the Young Earth Creationist model. Just the sheer amount of time, the ability to fit in all the varves. So somehow you're going to say in the past, multiple varves were set down, even though they don't have they wouldn't have a mechanism for doing that. I mean, what was different about the environment? As I said before, they would suggest there's more activity, but the varves that are formed are not formed from chaos, all right? It's not like, oh, there's a super active season and then a calm season, that's the couplet. It's more like differences in the types of organisms that are there, salinity, oxygen concentration. I mean, all these different types of things create this slight changes between different seasons, which then can be noticed by looking at chemical compositions, in very, very, very fine scale up through this column. And it can be just like, there's a year, 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 and so forth. And surely for the top 100 layers, right, the same type of analysis, the same method for analyzing that column reads off that 100 years as 100 varves, and that seems to be completely accurate. So there's nothing about what's farther down in that column that would suggest that there was something different about the past other than not as many tropical cyclones. And again, they stick out. They're separate events in that varve column, or I guess I should say they're inserted into varves, right? Because they're individual events within a year-long time frame. So as I said before, this is just this wouldn't be like the knockout blow for Young Earth Creationism is wrong. It's just one of 1,000 papers published every day that include data and information like this that you look at and you go like, I can very naturally describe this as thousands and thousands of years. And I don't have to twist and contort data. I don't have to manipulate anything. Whereas with Young Earth Creationism, I have to come up with all kinds of ad hoc explanations to be able to compress the data that's been generated here into a shorter time frame. And it's just, I don't think most lay individuals who don't have any scientific knowledge and who never think about or read anything beyond Young Earth Creationists realize that there's, like, people like me see this type of stuff every single day. I also wanted to bring this article up because I think most people don't know, like, the extent to which we study and try to understand past climates, right? This is one of many, many different projects in which we're exploring the history of climate over thousands of years in order to try to understand our climate today and the influences on our climate today. All right, that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me as we take a look at this paper on 5,700-year-old storm archive and what it can tell us about both our own climate today, potentially the climate in the future, and a critique of Young Earth Creationism. Thanks. Hang in there. We'll see you when we see you.